This is message number 2 in the Endtime Babylon series. It's entitled Biblical Principles for Interpreting Revelation 17 through 18. First, I want to talk about Endtime Babylon's literal and metaphorical meanings. A primary problem with efforts to identify Endtime Babylon is that many want to claim it means only one thing. But part of the reason that a biblical mystery like Endtime Babylon is obscure is that it is often communicated in symbols that have both literal and spiritual or metaphorical meanings. Therefore, we do not expect Endtime Babylon to have just one meaning that excludes all the others. Rather, it will have a few layers of complementary literal and metaphorical meaning. For example, the multi-layered meaning in Revelation 17 is demonstrated regarding the 7 heads on the beast in verse 3. The angel explains the 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits, but they are also 7 kings. Therefore, the symbolic heads mean 2 simultaneous things. However, notice that the biblical text always brings us back to a physical or literal meaning for prophetic scripture. For example, it is explained by the angel that the 7 heads refer to 7 literal hills and 7 literal kings. The multi-layered nature of end-time Babylon is also reflected in the name it is given, Babylon the Great, verse 5. This is the name given end-time Babylon its first and second mentions in the book of Revelation, chapter 14, verse 8, and chapter 16, verse 19. The name Babylon the Great is repeated a 4th time in 18:2. Clearly, this is an important name for this entity. It is also a complex one. Babylon in Revelation 17 through 18 means several things. First, it is referred to as a literal great city 8 times in the prophecy. This includes the last verse of chapter 17, where we read, "The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." It seems end-time Babylon will be centered in one literal city in the end times. But in the last verse of chapter 18, we read a very difficult statement. Chapter 18, verse 24. "In her, Babylon the Great, was found the blood of prophets and of God's holy people and of all who have been slaughtered on the earth." The word all is in the Greek text. That cannot be describing one literal city. That cannot be describing even one literal nation or empire. Such statements tell us that there are spiritual, transcendent, cosmic, and symbolic meanings to end-time Babylon. Because a literal interpretation cannot explain all of end-time Babylon's attributes, it is necessary to apply a biblical metaphor to accurately interpret its full meaning. That biblical metaphor is the anti-God world, capital W. And that is described throughout the New Testament as the values and systems empowered by the sinful nature and Satan. I discussed this meaning and concept in some detail in chapter 4 of the book, Endtime Babylon. Therefore, it is admitted that there is a very rare metaphorical meaning to this biblical prophecy in Revelation chapter 17 through 18. Unfortunately, many Bible scholars make the mistake of claiming that the prophecy will only have a spiritual meaning and fulfillment and will not have any literal, physical, or practical meaning for the church in the end times. That is a serious and even dangerous mistake. A primary strategy for this claim is to label the book of Revelation and chapter 17 through 18 as apocalyptic literature. Based on this label, it is further claimed that such a genre is intended to be interpreted primarily, perhaps even exclusively, in a metaphorical way. Therefore, the physical or literal meaning of Revelation is either completely ignored or greatly diminished. There are several errors in this approach. First, the distinctions between prophetic and apocalyptic scripture are not as clear or important as many would claim. Second, these same scholars of apocalyptic literature all label significant portions of Daniel in this same way. And yet, the apocalyptic prophecies of the large statue, described in Daniel 2:31, and the 4 great beasts, described in Daniel 7:3, were all physically fulfilled in the emergence of the Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. In other words, Daniel is proof that even prophetic scripture that some would label apocalyptic needs to be expected to be fulfilled in a physical way by a person, place, or event. Therefore, while it is admitted that the prophecy in Revelation 17 through 18 will uniquely have a metaphorical and spiritual meaning and fulfillment, once again, God expects us to understand the foundational, literal, or physical meaning of the symbolism. How do we know that? Because virtually all biblical prophecy ultimately refers to a physical and often literal person, place, or event. Accordingly, it was explained in the first book of the Endtimes Essentials series, Christ's End Times Teaching, quote, "There is a second rule for interpreting the meaning and fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Expect a biblical prophecy to be fulfilled in a physical way by a person, place, or event when there is no biblical or reasonable reason to do otherwise." Old Testament scholar J.B. Payne has provided what is probably the most detailed study of biblical prophecy available. In his Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy, he identified 592 Old Testament and New Testament prophecies that have already come true in history. Every single one of those almost 600 biblical prophecies was fulfilled in a physical way by a person, place, or event. None of those prophecies were fulfilled in merely a metaphorical or spiritualized way. This is true even in the many instances when God communicates a biblical prophecy in metaphorical or symbolic language. The prophecy still gets fulfilled in a physical and even literal way. Metaphorical interpreters need to be asked, when did God abandon his repeated practice of fulfilling biblical prophecy in a physical way? Contrary to the popular metaphorical view, God has not changed the way he will fulfill biblical prophecy. Every single prophecy in human history was fulfilled in either a literal or physical person, place, or event. The prophecies in Revelation 17 through 18 will not be an exception. Therefore, Endtime Babylon's metaphorical meaning does not exhaust the literal and physical meaning of the prophecy. Accordingly, several descriptions of it reflect a physical place. It is referred to as a city 6 times. However, Endtime Babylon also represents a nation. Accordingly, an unfulfilled prophecy in Jeremiah clearly implies Endtime Babylon will be more than one city, but also a nation of cities. God says in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 32, "I will light a fire in the cities, plural, of Babylon that will burn up everything around them." Again, this prophecy has never been fulfilled, but it will be in Endtime Babylon, and the cities referred to imply a nation. Like ancient Babylon and Rome, Endtime Babylon will be a nation empire centered in a city. Therefore, the entire nation or cities of Endtime Babylon will reflect its attributes and suffer its destruction, although all of this will be centered in one particular city. More arguments for this will be offered in message number 6. There are other references to Endtime Babylon which reflect its physical rather than merely metaphorical character. The Antichrist and 10-nation coalition will physically attack Endtime Babylon and will permanently remove all people from her and burn her down with fire, such that no one will ever work there again or be married there again. People live in a physical place. But contrary to a metaphorical view, this is not predicting the complete depopulation of the entire world. Rather, it is describing the physical destruction of a particular place and people. Accordingly, God commands in this prophecy again, "Move out of Babylon the Great, my people, so that you will not experience her being struck hard with a sudden and severe disaster." Again, this is referring to real people physically escaping a physical place because of a very real and physical destruction. This will be discussed further in a later message. In fact, Endtime Babylon will be a physical, although limited, place for eternity, as the smoke of her will go up forever and ever, Revelation 19:3. Therefore, we see that Endtime Babylon has both literal and metaphorical meanings. Accordingly, the rather complex mystery of Babylon the Great in this prophecy is that it represents 3 layers of meaning and scope. 3 layers. 1, the metaphorical anti-God world. 2, a literal and physical nation. And 3, all concentrated in a literal and physical city. Unfortunately, much of the church today is only focused on the metaphorical meaning of Revelation 17 through 18. However, when the prophecies of Endtime Babylon's physical destruction are being fulfilled, no one will care at all about its metaphorical meaning. And only its physical meaning will have any value, which is why its physical meaning is the focus of the Endtime Babylon materials. Next, I want to talk about Endtime Babylon's partial and complete fulfillments of destruction, which makes Old Testament prophecies regarding Babylon relevant to us today. The concept of multiple fulfillments of biblical prophecies is widely recognized by Bible scholars. Many of them have both near and partial and final and complete fulfillments. This is discussed further elsewhere in some of my material on my website. This principle certainly applies to biblical prophecies about Babylon. There are many predictions about its attributes and destruction, particularly in Isaiah and Jeremiah. Some of these Old Testament prophecies about Babylon have had near and partial fulfillments in the past. But Bible scholars agree that some of Isaiah's and Jeremiah's predictions about Babylon have never occurred yet in history. Accordingly, John MacArthur writes, quote, "The Old Testament predictions of Babylon's total destruction was only partially fulfilled when the Persians sacked the ancient city of Babylon. As is the case with many Old Testament prophecies, those predictions had both a near and a far fulfillment. Babylon indeed will be permanently destroyed as recorded in Revelation, but this has not happened yet. The prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah also refer to this future destruction of end-time Babylon," unquote. The prophet Jeremiah died around 570 BC. About 30 years later, the near partial fulfillment of his predictions about the fall of Babylon came true. The Persian king Cyrus invaded the city in 539 BC. Babylon became an important capital in the Persian Empire. About 200 years later, Babylon surrendered to Alexander the Great in 333 BC. Alexander also sought to restore the city and lived, and he died there. But the prophet Jeremiah predicted there will be a time in the future when Babylon will never again be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. Her dwellings will be set on fire. Jeremiah chapter 50 and 51. These things have never happened. Babylon was never burned. And listen carefully, Babylon exists even today with a small population of people living there, which has always been the case. And yet the prophet says, everything the Lord has planned against Babylon stands unchanged. Babylon will be left desolate without a single inhabitant. This prophecy remains unchanged because it has not yet been fulfilled. Accordingly, even 200 years after the city of Babylon had fallen into ruins, the book of Revelation predicted the future destruction of end-time Babylon. There is a reason that an end-time city nation is referred to as Babylon 6 times in the New Testament book of Revelation. It makes prophecies about Babylon in the Old Testament to be relevant in the end times. Unfulfilled predictions about ancient Babylon become prophecies about end-time Babylon. Because of the nature of many biblical prophecies having more than one fulfillment, we have precedent to interpret the unfulfilled predictions about ancient Babylon in Isaiah and Jeremiah as applying in appropriate ways to end-time Babylon. Therefore, it is not only Revelation that gives us information about the attributes and destruction of end-time Babylon. Isaiah chapters 13 through 14 and 47 and Jeremiah chapters 50 through 51 do so as well. For example, notice that in both Isaiah and Revelation, God says the following about Babylon. Isaiah chapter 47, verses 7 through 8. "You said, I am forever the eternal queen. I am, and there is none besides me. I will never be a widow or suffer the loss of children." And then we read in Revelation 18:7 in the New Testament. "In her, Babylon, heart, she boasts, I sit enthroned as a queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn." God said the first statement in Isaiah about ancient Babylon around 700 BC. About 800 years later, after ancient Babylon was in ruins, he described end-time Babylon in the Revelation in exactly the same way. Therefore, an ancient prophecy about Babylon was brought right into the book of Revelation, predicting the far future application of the same prophecy. Therefore, Isaiah and Jeremiah also give us information about the attributes and destruction of end-time Babylon in the future. For example, the parallels between Jeremiah chapters 50 through 51 and Revelation chapters 17 through 18 are obvious. For example, both describe Babylon as follows, with the name Babylon, compared to a gold cup, dwelling on many waters and making the nations drunk. Both describe Babylon's destruction as suddenly, by fire, never to be inhabited again, and illustrated with a rock sunk in water. Both Jeremiah and Revelation describe the response to Babylon's destruction as one, commanding God's people to flee beforehand, and heaven's rejoicing. It should not surprise us that so much prophetic scripture is being condensed and culminating in the final chapters of the Bible. And it requires an understanding of much of that Old Testament prophetic scripture to understand Revelation 17 through 18. Therefore, Old Testament prophecies, particularly regarding Babylon's destruction, will be used in the following messages as confirming revelation about the identity and destruction of end-time Babylon revealed in the book of Revelation. Next, let's talk about the various views on Revelation chapter 17 through 18. A primary topic in the Endtime Babylon materials is its correct identification. Let us begin by noting the most popular interpretations of Endtime Babylon in Revelation 17 through 18. These are listed in a suggested order of their popularity in scholarly evangelical sources today. 1. A spiritual metaphor for the anti-God world. 2. First century Rome or Jerusalem, Israel. 3. A future one-world government. 4. A worldwide false religion, perhaps Roman Catholicism, Islam, New Age, or a future religion that does not exist today. 5th, a future rebuilt city of Babylon in Iraq. 6, America, the spiritual prostitute and the economic, cultural, and military superpower of the world, centered in New York City. These are the most recognized interpretations of Revelation 17 through 18 throughout the church's history and today. The messages in the Endtime Babylon series will argue that a combination of interpretations number 1 and number 6 are correct. At a macro metaphorical level, Endtime Babylon represents the entire anti-God world system. But the prophecy is also describing a physical nation and a city within that nation. It will be argued in the Endtime Babylon series that this is America with its financial and cultural capital of New York City. The weaknesses of the other views will be thoroughly discussed, particularly in message number 8. In the process, the likelihood that Endtime Babylon's America will become even more evident. The alternative views will be briefly described here. Perhaps the most popular interpretation of Revelation 17 through 18 is view 1, a metaphorical approach. Again, the metaphorical meaning of Endtime Babylon is discussed further in chapter 4 of my book. However, as also noted above, almost 600 biblical prophecies have already been fulfilled in history, and every one of them was fulfilled in a physical way by a person, place, or event. Therefore, we should identify a literal nation and city that will physically fulfill the prophecy in Revelation 17 through 18. Another popular view is that Revelation 17 through 18 has already been largely fulfilled in the first century city of Rome or Jerusalem. But most of these scholars recognize the phenomenon of the near final and partial complete fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Accordingly, while some see many important reflections of Rome or Jerusalem in Endtime Babylon, they agree that it will be finally and completely fulfilled in the end times in some way. Interpretations number 3 through 5 are common, especially among pre-tribulationists, because they value the more literal interpretation of prophetic scripture, which is a good thing. These include Endtime Babylon being a one-world government, a worldwide religion, or literally a rebuilt city in Iraq. But all of these views ignore one important thing. The clearest and most repeated description of Endtime Babylon is that it will be the world's economic superpower when the end times begin. That is crystal clear in the prophecy. It is not primarily described as a political or government institution, but an economic one. As will be argued, Endtime Babylon will certainly be promoting a religion, but it will not be a formal institutionalized faith. Rather, the religion Endtime Babylon will be promoting is the worship of wealth. Finally, when one understands the economic and cultural power that Endtime Babylon will exercise at the beginning of the end times, the idea that it will be fulfilled by some rebuilt metropolis in the desert of Iraq seems highly unlikely. Accordingly, it is again confidently claimed that an unbiased interpretation of Revelation chapter 17 through 18 will reveal the superiority of understanding it to be the United States of America. In my next message, we will talk about Endtime Babylon's destruction in the sequence of end-time events.